Bassmaster Elite Pro, Brandon Cobb here. Today we're gonna talk about some spotted bass. They're loved, hated, ignored, I don't know what you wanna call them, but certain times of year, spotted bass just come into play. There's lakes all around the country, they get big and they compete with largemouths, and you can actually catch big enough spotted bass to win tournaments. So I'm gonna talk about kind of the seasonal progression and how I target spotted bass all around the year. When it comes to spotted bass movement, the winter time is probably the best time to target spotted bass just because they get so grouped up. A lot of spotted bass in the summer, they get so nomadic that they're following that bait around, they get really tough to catch. But in the winter, spotted bass really like to get around that bait. But nowadays with front-looking sonars, active target, jerkbait can't go wrong target suspending fish. This is Yo-Zuri 3DB 110. This is a white pearl. I like white pearl, especially targeting some of those suspended fish because they can see it. They can come get it. It's natural enough where they'll bite it, but bright enough for them to come see it. This bait will get down 6 to 8 foot, but you gotta keep in mind in this clear water, you don't necessarily have to get the bait down to the depth of the fish. They can see pretty well, and spotted bass lakes tend to be clear lakes. So this is a great suspended fish bait. Throw it on a Century Cobb Series rod, gravity reel from Arc. This is kind of one of those just staples. Gotta have it tied on. I don't throw it all day in the winter. In the spring now, this is more of like a keep in your hand, lock it in type bait. But in the winter, a lot of those fish are roaming around. This is like when you see the situation, see one in the right location, you can get out there and reach them. If they are a little too deep, like that jerk bait, say you find some suspended, 25 down in 30, 40 foot of water, can't quite get a jerk bait to them, obviously. So just some type of, I use a Zoom Super Fluke Junior, some type of baitfish oriented small bait. Usually some are eating herring on these lakes, but then a lot of times they're eating smaller threadfin shad. This is just a Super Fluke Junior on a hand poured little 1/4 ounce head. And you just throw it out there, kind of work it down. You can swim it, keep it at the depth you want. Sometimes I'll switch to a small paddle tail swim bait. But this Super Fluke Junior, pretty cool bait you can fish at any depths. It's like a suspended fish bait that if they're suspended too deep to get a hard bait down to, this is a good bait to get to them and they'll bite it as well. So when they get on that bait fish, a lot of those fish roam around, you catch them on front looking sonar, but then some of the big groups will actually get out really, really deep. I've caught them out to 70 foot, but I would say 30 to 50 is about normal depth. In that 30 to 50 foot, it's really hard to cast, especially when you get out to that 40 or 50. Your bait just doesn't present well if you're casting, if you're making long casts, so it's more a vertical fishing game. So when it comes to vertical fishing, I pretty much, spotted bass fish have 3 baits that I rely on to catch those. I would say the number one I use the most is just a simple drop shot. This is just I just use a 3/8 ounce drop shot weight, small little nose hook. Sometimes I'll switch to a Texas rig if there's a ton of deep timber, because you tend to get hung and those fish relate to the deep timber pretty well. But I like a small shad shaped bait. That's a tiny fluke. Sometimes I'll go up to that Super Fluke Junior. But just nose hook, drop shot. And what this is kind of like a search bait. I kind of pitch it. A lot of those spotted bass are really stuck to the bottom. So I'll kind of pitch this out, let it go down to the bottom. When I see what looks like it may be fish on the graph, like some lumps on the bottom or something like that on the Lowrance, and I'll lift it up and see if fish are looking at it. And then once I catch one, generally spotted bass, they're schooled tight fish. So when you catch one, they blow up on the graph. Like I call it bringing a Christmas tree up. You reel that fish off the bottom, there may be 40 with him, trying to get that bait out of his mouth. So when I do that, I catch that fish, and then I got my 1-2 punch here. It's just a jigging spoon. Put a swivel above it to keep line twist down. I really like a 1 ounce. The reason I use 1 ounce is because when you hook these fish and pull them up, you got to get it down there fast. It's comparative to schooling fish. That drop shot light line, you just can't reel them up fast enough. So it's a good bait to get them biting, and then I like the spoon to keep them biting. Then the other bait, it's kind of an untraditional vertical bait, I guess you'd say, is I like to just drop a 1/4 ounce shaky head on them. A lot of times those fish actually want the bait on the bottom, like stuck in the mud, because they'll actually have mud on their bellies. They're so tight to the bottom, and they're hard to see on the graph because of this. But just a 1/4 ounce greenfish shaky head with a Zoom trick worm, I just drop this down and essentially drag it while I'm kind of graphing. Like I'll just keep it right below the boat, shaking it very gently, keep it on the bottom. You'll catch a lot of fish that you can barely see on the graph. It'll just be lumps on the bottom. Like, I think that might be fish. It's just, I call it fuzzy bottom. You just see something that looks weird and drag this shaky head around. That's another bait that I'll get them fired up with and then when they're fired up, I shoot that spoon right back down to keep them biting. A lot of spotted bass lakes are inherently clear. They're just so clear that fishing the bank can be kind of tough on your average day. But if you get like a really windy day, really cloudy day, rain, something nasty to break up that light penetration, or you get kind of an abnormal rainfall, like maybe it rained real hard at whatever spotted bass lake you're fishing and some creeks get dirty where they're not normally dirty, where a lot of spotted bass are living, kind of out more towards the main lake. And when that happens, there's some awesome ways to catch them, specifically cranking. I love to crank for spotted bass when you get those key situations. I don't do it all the time, but you have to be ready when it happens. I use these two small Yo-Zuri crankbaits. This is a hardcore shad 60. This is Yo-Zuri 3D RX mid runner. It's a 6 to 8 foot diving crankbait. Both of these are. I would say the dual hardcore shad is a little more finessey crankbait. So it has not quite the aggressive vibration, but both in crawl pattern. And these are just 6 to 8 foot diving crankbaits you can run the bank with, fishing shallow rock. Spotted bass will act a lot like a largemouth when you get those conditions. You just target shallow rock, points, anything like that, especially in some dirty water. You'll catch, you know, largemouth and spots, both doing the same thing. And these are just bank running crankbaits, so I call it. I like red when it's cold. I'll use some shad colors, you know, if it's not, maybe it's more winter and not quite moving into that February, March, but February, March is when this really, really shines. And then after that kind of springtime, you know, biting frenzy between the spawn, the shad spawn, just the good time of year. You know, everybody knows springtime's when the bass bite. Well, in the summer, they're still on that bait, but the difference is that bait is not specific in an area. That bait's just roaming around in the middle of the lake for the most part, middle of those creeks. So spotted bass get a lot trickier to catch, but a topwater is probably the staple, especially on any herring lake, from June all the way through October, September, October, when it's hot. When it's hot weather, the spots, one of the best ways to catch them is target key structure with, such as brush piles with a worm, like a shaky head or a drop shot, or cover water out and catch those suspended fish on a big topwater. Once it starts turning over and it starts getting more into that true fall, you know, November, back down into that 50-degree water, you're starting to get right back into that cold weather, wintertime pattern where the fish they're still bait oriented. If you're noticing a trend, spots like to eat. So that's, they're getting back on that bait, but the bait's starting to get in the creeks deep again to where you can target them with the same, you know, vertical or suspended fish concepts that you use. So it kind of is a full transition. It's bait all year, but there's just certain times of year where I think spots are more targetable. It's always colder weather, tends to be some of the best spotted bass fishing you'll get the whole year. So I love to target spotted bass certain times of year, target them more than I do others, but that's kind of my rundown throughout a 365-day, year-long process, what I'm looking for if I'm targeting spots, and hopefully it'll help you catch more spotted bass in the future.